Well, welcome. And we're talking today about using the scale framework in solution focused practice. I think lots of people are asking themselves the question, what is the place of scales within the model? Which in some ways, I guess, is surprising. Since if you had asked the key developer of these ideas, Steve DeShazer, about scales, he always said that the scale framework was the single technique within the approach that he would find it hardest to give up. So he saw scale questions as absolutely central to everything that he did. And yet nowadays, people are asking themselves, what place do these scale questions have within the model as it has evolved? And I guess as solution focus has evolved, the key word that's become more and more important, and actually as it happens, you can find it even in DeShazer's early books, is the word description. That in solution focus, we're inviting people to describe their lives in very particular ways, in very specific ways. And what we're describing, what we're inviting people to describe, you could say, is difference. So when we ask people, what are your best hopes from our talking together? And how will you know that's happening? We're asking people to describe difference, future difference. And of course, when we begin to ask people about the elements of that future, wished for future, hoped for future, that they already have or have had, we're talking about past and present difference. So what is it that scale questions are about, really? And for me, scale questions, it's not the numbers that are important. What's important in scales are the descriptions that we can hang off the numbers. So let's have a quick look at the typical structure, the core structure of a scale. And typically what we've got are three areas of inquiry. So the way that we might structure the scale is as follows. On a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 representing, and most typically, we might say all of your best hopes happening, okay? And 0 representing, and we have to decide what 0 represents. We'll come back to that in a moment. Where do you see yourself now? And after some thought, well, sometimes less thought, sometimes more thought, the client gives us an answer. And if the answer is more than 0, more than 0, we follow up that initial question with what tells you that you're at that point on the scale and not at 0. And having elicited a description of what tells the service user they're at that point on the scale, wherever they are, and not at 0, we can then ask the service user, imagine that you move just 1 point up on the scale and find yourself at wherever 1 point is. How could you know that you're 1 point up? And again, we're inviting people into descriptions. And of course, just to remind you, it's not the numbers that are most important. What's most important are the descriptions that we hang off the numbers. So scale questions are merely a tool to support people and to facilitate describing, to support people in describing, and to facilitate the emergence of those descriptions. So let's just look at some of the key practice pointers. And the first, very simply, is look, you have to make a decision about the bottom of the scale. Do you prefer 0, 0, or do you prefer 1? And some people prefer 0 and some people prefer 1. And in my view, that's a very personal decision that makes little or no difference. Look, there's some people who say, oh, putting 0 at the bottom of the scale is inherently miserable. We don't want people to notice they're at 0. I'd prefer them to actually anchor the scale at 1 in that sense. So somehow, and often people actually who talk about scales in that way, they visualize scales sort of as a ladder, which in fact I wouldn't. And they visualize scales as well. At least people have got their foot on the bottom rung of the ladder. That's how people think about it. Now, I have always been a 0 person. My view personally is, if people are finding life really, really tough, I would prefer them to be able to say 0, because 0 chimes with and fits with the experience of life being really, really tough. Whereas somehow only to offer people 1 feels to me a little bit tricksy. But there you go. That's up to you. And once you've made your decision, 0 and 1, we have to be clear about what the meanings of the scale are. We have to anchor it every now and again. You hear people saying things, so on a scale of 0 to 10, where are you? Look, it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. The client couldn't possibly actually know how to answer that question, because we haven't said either what 0 or what 10 actually mean. So if we're using, for example, a best hope scale, 10 stands for all of your best hopes happening. That's the most common scale that I would ever use. And I would then fill in the detail, what the person's told me about the best hopes. I guess I would remind them. But it's the bottom of the scale. Look, you could just say, and some people do, 0 stands for the opposite of that. That's very simple. You could say 0 stands for the point you were referred. That's the scale that Steve DeShazer typically used. Or you could use, and this is the one that I typically use, 0 stands for the furthest from 10 you've ever been. Some people try and use 0 stands for the worst you can imagine things being. I find that harder to work with as it happens, but there you go. So you have to actually invite people to know what this scale might mean. And then the answer might actually, in some senses, mean something at the very least to them. Look, the third thing is that what I think we need to do is we do need to think hard about 0. And words are power. What we don't want to do is to expand the definition of 0. You know, sometimes people feel tempted to give examples. You know, 0 stands for, you know, you become completely hopeless, you can't get out of bed, you're not managing to get to work, you're not doing anything. And the more examples you give, the more possibility there is of the client seeing elements of their experience that fit with 0. So in a curious way, we've expanded the capacity of 0. We've actually empowered 0 to contain and to bring in within itself more of the client's experience. And we really don't want to do that. We don't want to give words to problems that the client hadn't already given. So let's keep 0 fairly generic. 0's the opposite. That's okay. 0's the toughest things have ever been. That's okay. 0 is the point you're referred. That's okay. But let's not give examples at the bottom of the scale. So that's the third thing about scales. And the fourth thing is, look, take your time. What we often see are people rushing over the what tells you you're there. They're so keen to move on to 1 point up that almost they neglect what tells you you're there. And in many ways, I think that's one of the most useful bits of this approach. People giving us a description of the history of the preferred future. What tells you you're there? So where are you now? I'm at 4. So what is it that tells you you're at 4 and not 0? And what else and what else and what else? Obviously you can't go like that. What else and what else and what else? That would be a bit crude. But you need to be interested. You could slip in a mini list if you wanted to. Tell me 20 things that tell you you're at 4 and not 0. So take your time over the evidence that tells us that people are already there. Let's not rush over it in our enthusiasm for moving up the scale. Look, the fifth practice pointer is we're interested in signs and evidence, not steps and strategies. So we're not asking people, what have you got to do to move up the scale? That's a problem-solving question. We're asking people, imagine you move up just 1 point on your scale and find yourself 1 point up. How will you know? And find yourself in that framing, find yourself. The moving gets lost. What we're emphasizing is the evidence, the signs. How do you know? What tells you you're 1 point up on that scale? So we're interested in the signs or the evidence, not what people have to do. And when people are moving up, we're not inviting them somehow to set out an action plan, just tentative evidence that tells them they're 1 point up. How could you know? How might you know that you're just 1 point up on that scale? So keep it tentative. It doesn't have to be certain. These are examples and they're possibilities. We're in the world of possibilities. We're not actually asking people to have to know for sure. So they're the practice pointers. Now, why are scales useful? And the first thing is that scales allow us to get into the gap between 0 and 10, to leverage all the points between things are great or things are terrible. You know, sometimes people talk in great and terrible terms. The scale allows us to get in the gap between great and terrible and to invite the points between the gap between 0 and 10, invite them to make a difference. The scale is inherently hopeful. The scale joins wherever the client is to 10 by a maximum of 10 points. There's a line that's been constructed between wherever they are and where they want to be. And the scale gives people a language to talk about subtle differences that are difficult to get at. Steve DeShazer always said that scales were particularly important when people were vague in their descriptions, when they were finding it hard to put differences into language. The scales give them a way of talking about those things. And the number, it does, at the least, help to make the change concrete or tangible. Look, in some senses, it helps to make the change, the progress, real for people. It's not just that people have begun to think that it might be a little easier to make themselves a cup of tea. I remember someone saying that to me once. Actually, she had begun to notice that it was a little easier not to make the cup of tea, but to imagine making the cup of tea. That is a tiny change. That is a very subtle change. But actually identifying that she had moved half a point up brought a certain level of tangibility to that very subtle, very delicate change. So, scales are useful. They serve a place in our new description-based model, and they're useful because they support us in describing future differences and in describing past differences. So look, there it is. There's some ideas about scales. And of course, there's loads of different scales you can use. And good luck with experimenting. And here's some connections, here's some links, lots of other places where you can find out more about the work of Brief and the Brief team and the training opportunities that the Brief team offers. Thank you.